The plane took off from Culiacan on July 25, 2024, carrying a man who had been ambushed, bound, and forced onto the flight against his will. He was 76 years old. He had never spent a single night in prison, and in less than an hour, that would change forever. The man's name was Ismael Zambada Garcia. Most people who feared him just called him El Mayo. For nearly 40 years, he had run one of the largest drug trafficking operations the world has ever seen, and in all that time, not one government had managed to put him behind bars. He didn't hide in caves. He didn't live on the run. He moved through the mountains of Sinaloa like a man who owned the weather itself. But the plane wasn't headed toward any property showing. It was headed toward Santa Teresa, New Mexico, and toward American federal agents waiting on the tarmac. The person who arranged the flight was Joaquin Guzman Lopez, a young man Zambada had known for years. Someone whose own father had built half of the empire Zambada now ran alone. Right now, this matters. The most careful man in the drug trade was lured to a meeting under false pretenses, ambushed, and forced onto the plane against his will. To understand how someone that careful got caught that easily, you have to go back to the beginning, back to a partnership formed in the late 1980s, between two men who would build something neither of them could fully control. Zambada and Joaquin Guzman, the man the world came to know as El Chapo, co-founded the Sinaloa Cartel together, splitting duties in a way that made the organization nearly impossible to kill. El Chapo was loud, flashy, obsessed with tunnels and prison breaks and headlines. Zambada was the opposite. He rarely gave interviews. He didn't flaunt wealth. Former associates and investigators have described him as the operational brain, the man who kept supply chains moving even when his partner was locked up or on the run. And that division of labor worked for decades, while El Chapo escaped from prison twice and became the face featured on wanted posters worldwide. Zambada stayed in the background, running logistics, protecting infrastructure, quietly becoming the one person law enforcement genuinely struggled to locate. He avoided the spotlight entirely, and that discipline is exactly what kept him free for so long. So how does a man like that build an empire that outlasts every rival, every raid, every change in government on both sides of the border? Subscribe to this channel, because the answer says a lot about how power in the drug trade actually survives. The scale of what Zambada built becomes clear once you look at what he later admitted to in court. When he eventually pleaded guilty, he confirmed that his organization had shipped a minimum of 1.5 million kilograms of cocaine into the United States over several decades. That number represents a supply chain spanning multiple countries, thousands of people, and enough money to make Zambada one of the wealthiest criminal figures alive. But wealth built on that scale requires protection, and protection requires violence. Zambada's organization didn't survive by accident. It survived because rivals who challenged it tended to disappear, and because law enforcement officials who got too close often found themselves outmatched or outbid. This is the part of the story that doesn't get romanticized in documentaries. Every kilogram that crossed the border represented a chain of decisions, bribes, and threats that touched entire communities and criminal networks alike. For most of Zambada's career, this system worked in his favor. Governments came and went. Presidents on both sides changed. His partner El Chapo eventually did get caught, extradited to the United States in 2017, and sentenced to life in a maximum security prison. Zambada, meanwhile, just kept operating. He adjusted, recalibrated, and stayed one step removed from every investigation that circled his empire. Which raises an obvious question. If the man who built half the operation went down years earlier, why did it take so long to catch the other half? The answer centers on a betrayal from inside Zambada's own circle, and that betrayal came from someone who shared his blood with the empire's other founder. Joaquin Guzman Lopez is one of El Chapo's sons, part of a group of brothers investigators call Los Chapitos. By 2024, tension had been building for years between the Chapitos and the old guard loyal to Zambada. The younger generation wanted control. Zambada, still alive and still influential even in his mid-70s, represented an obstacle to that ambition. On July 25, 2024, Guzman Lopez lured Zambada to a meeting under the guise of helping resolve a local political dispute. Soon, the plane crossed the border and landed in New Mexico, where American federal agents were already waiting. Zambada walked into a trap set by family loyalty to a rival faction. Arranged by someone whose own father had helped build the operation Zambada spent decades protecting. If this story is hitting different than the typical cartel headline, take a second to hit like. It genuinely helps the algorithm show this to more people who need to hear how these organizations actually fall apart from the inside. News of the arrest set off a war that nobody inside Sinaloa was fully prepared for. Within weeks, the cartel's internal balance collapsed, and by September 9th, 2024, open conflict had broken out between two factions fighting over what remained of Zambada's territory and infrastructure. On one side stood Los Mayos, fighters and lieutenants who remained loyal to Zambada, even with their leader now sitting in an American jail cell. On the other side stood Los Chapitos, the faction aligned with El Chapo's sons, the same group whose betrayal had triggered the arrest in the first place. What had once been a single, coordinated cartel splintered into two armed factions fighting each other for control of smuggling routes, safe houses, and loyalty from lower-level operatives who suddenly had to choose sides. The fighting became a sustained conflict that has dragged on for nearly 2 years, and the casualties tell a story that headlines about legal battles and billion-dollar forfeitures often leave out entirely. From September 2024 through May 2026, official records tracked 2,829 homicides in Sinaloa, a huge surge heavily driven by this internal war. Each casualty represents a person, a family, a community absorbing the consequences of a power vacuum created the moment Zambada's plane landed in New Mexico. The violence spread beyond street-level gunfights between rival lieutenants. In March 2026, Mexican Navy forces raided a property linked to Los Mayos, targeting a leader known as El Patas, whose real name is Omar Oswaldo Torres. The operation succeeded in capturing Torres, but it also left 11 other suspected cartel members dead on that same property. One raid, 11 bodies, and the war kept going regardless. 3 months later, in June 2026, Mexican security forces arrested another major figure, a Los Chapitos commander named Gabriel Nicolas Martinez Larios, known on the street as Gabito. Authorities linked him to kidnappings and killings targeting mining workers in the region, evidence that the war had expanded beyond cartel versus cartel violence, and into the lives of ordinary laborers who had nothing to do with either faction. The fighting that started over one arrest had metastasized into something that touched an entire regional economy, which brings the story back to the man whose capture started all of this. Sitting in a Brooklyn courtroom nearly 2 years after that flight from Culiacan, finally facing the consequences of decades spent building an empire that was now tearing itself apart without him. On August 25, 2025, Zambada pleaded guilty to racketeering conspiracy, running a continuing criminal enterprise, and additional drug trafficking charges, bypassing a long, dramatic trial. A guilty plea meant no jury, no extended courtroom battle, no drawn-out spectacle. It meant the case moved directly towards sentencing, and Zambada himself had to stand in front of a federal judge and account for 4 decades of decisions. That sentencing finally arrived on July 20th, 2026. U.S. District Judge Brian Kogan handed down a life sentence without the possibility of parole. For a man who had spent nearly 40 years avoiding exactly this outcome, the moment arrived quietly through a courtroom procedure and a signature on a legal document. Judge Kogan also ordered Zambada to forfeit $15 billion, an enormous number. Many people assume that kind of wealth can buy protection, connections, or leniency, especially for someone who spent decades building relationships with corrupt officials across multiple levels of government. But the forfeiture order made something clear. At that scale, the money didn't buy freedom. It became part of the punishment itself. That $15 billion figure requires precision, because it's easy to picture agents hauling out vaults of cash. That's not what happened. This is a legal forfeiture judgment, a court order establishing what Zambada owes and what the government has the authority to pursue. Recovering that money from hidden accounts, shell companies, and property scattered across multiple countries is a separate, ongoing process, one that could take years and may never fully succeed. The number represents the scale of what Zambada built, rather than cash currently sitting in a government vault. The events inside that courtroom on July 20th, 2026, carried unusual weight. Zambada, 76 years old, spoke through a translator and apologized for his role and what he had built. His exact words, as translated in court, were that if there was one thing he could say that had value that day, it was that the violence must end. Coming from most defendants, a line like that might sound rehearsed, another attempt to soften a sentence already decided. But coming from the man whose capture had directly triggered a war that had already claimed thousands of lives in Sinaloa, the statement carries different weight. He acknowledged the war his own arrest had unleashed, a war that showed no signs of ending just because he'd finally admitted guilt. The story might have ended there, with a life sentence, a forfeiture order, and an old man's apology closing a chapter that started in the late 1980s. But governments don't always agree on how a story like this should end, and Mexico's leadership had questions of its own that complicated the entire narrative. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum spent the better part of 2 years questioning how exactly Zambada ended up in American custody in the first place. The United States government maintained that its agents didn't participate in any operation on Mexican soil. that the arrest resulted from arrangements made independently by Guzman Lopez, not from a cross-border operation planned by American officials. Sheinbaum wasn't fully convinced. On July 21st, 2026, just one day after the life sentence came down, Sheinbaum publicly raised a pointed question. If the United States genuinely had no operational role in Zambada's capture, why had the actual transport plane used in the arrest later been displayed at an air museum inside the United States? It's the kind of detail that seems small on its own, a plane sitting on display somewhere. Recontextualized against 2 years of denials, it became a contradiction that Mexico's own Attorney General's office decided to investigate formally. That investigation, launched by Mexican authorities in July 2026, centers on whether the United States violated Mexican sovereignty during the 2024 operation. It's an active inquiry, not a settled matter. And it means the story of how Zambada actually ended up on American soil remains genuinely unresolved, even with the man himself now serving a life sentence thousands of miles from the mountains he once controlled. So where does that leave things? A 76-year-old man sits in an American federal prison for the rest of his life, having admitted to shipping over 1 million kilograms of cocaine across a border he never personally had to cross to profit from it. $15 billion in assets sit under a forfeiture judgment that authorities will spend years, maybe longer, trying to actually collect. And back in Sinaloa, a war that broke out on September 9th, 2024, about 6 weeks after his plane landed in New Mexico, has already killed more than 2,800 people, with no clear sign of stopping just because the man at its center finally admitted what he'd built. Zambada's own words, released in a public letter by his lawyer, suggested he understood the violence needed to end. But wars between rival factions rarely stop because the person who once held them together says so from behind prison walls. Los Mayos and Los Chapitos are still fighting over territory that used to answer to one man. And every arrest, every raid, every captured commander so far has only reshuffled who controls the pieces, not ended the fighting itself. Mexico's investigation into how this all started is still open. The money is still, mostly, unrecovered. And the war his capture triggered is still, as of this recording, unresolved. If any part of this story stuck with you, like and subscribe, because there's a lot more buried in how these empires rise, fracture, and refuse to actually end.